Now, I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled Budgeting for People Who Hate Budgeting. This webinar is particularly exciting because it's a webinar produced by a young alumni for young alumni. So I'm excited to share that with you today. Our presenter today is UChicago alumna Michelle Waymeyer. Michelle is a fiduciary financial advisor and finance coach, as well as the founder of Young and Scrappy, a specialty practice geared towards serving young professionals, artists, entrepreneurs, and the LGBTQ plus folks. Michelle received her bachelor's from the University of Chicago in 2011 and holds her MBA from the University of Tennessee. She's a chartered financial analyst, CFA charter holder, and has been quoted and featured in US News, Glamour, Bustle, local NPR, the list goes on and on. You can read more about her work at www.youngandscrappy.com. Now, that is enough from me. You guys are here to see Michelle. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michelle.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am so excited to be here to present to you today on budgeting for people who hate budgeting. That's my short, succinct title. If I were to give this webinar another name, it would be How to Reach Your Money Goals Without Tracking Every Single Dang Penny You Spend. So we're going to get right into it. We only have an hour. I am very, very excited to share this info with you. We already did a little bit of intro on me, but I love helping people with their money. Feel free to find me online or on Instagram after this, but we'll cut to the chase. Today, we are talking budgets. Budgeting is, for a lot of people, an unpopular topic. We don't love to budget necessarily, but the bottom line is it's the foundation of your successful financial strategy. It helps you understand where your money's going. It helps you plan ahead for your goals. And so, you might consider it a necessary evil in some ways, but I hope that by the end of this presentation, we can get to a place where maybe we don't think it's so evil together. The simplest definition of a budget is telling your money where to go. I love this quote because I think, again, a lot of us tend to overthink it. When we think of the word budgeting, this overwhelming task comes up. We think of spreadsheets and nitpicky details and numbers. And if you're not a particularly quantitative person, and a lot of us aren't, that's okay. Budgeting can feel very overwhelming, but rather I want to shift that definition for you a little bit, thinking about this just as, telling your money where to go. I want to take off some of the edge. I want to make it a little bit more informal. It does not have to be fancy in order to get the job done. So just to kind of kick things off, I want to do a quick poll so that I know kind of where everyone's at today. Where are you guys all at in your budget journey?
We'll give it just a few more seconds for everyone to answer here, and then I will share the results.
Yeah, no shame, you guys, no shame.
All right, here we go. So it looks like 70% of our respondents say that they've dabbled in the past, but maybe it hasn't quite stuck. 17% say I've never budgeted in my life, but I want to start. No better time to start than now, guys. And then 12% are budget masters, go you, but you're looking for an easier way.
Awesome. All right, so that sounds pretty familiar for folks who have dabbled in the past, but it hasn't quite stuck. I totally get you. We're going to talk a lot about why traditional budget systems don't necessarily serve us, but wherever you're at in your journey, wherever you want to be, and whatever your motivation is for joining today, totally got your back. Hopefully, no matter where you're at in the process, you can take something good out of this. So today, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about why traditional budgets don't necessarily work. And then we'll talk about some ways that the Young and Scrappy budgeting system is different. We're going to hit that with a little bit of theory on the front end in true UChicago style, and then we'll kind of close with some of the more practical elements, the practice of how you can actually get started, get some information in one place, move forward. And then at the end, we'll try and leave ample time for Q&A just to make sure that any other little questions you have get answered before we part ways. So let's kick things off, and we'll start with traditional budgeting. Traditional budgets, they just don't work the way that we want them to. And honestly, in my personal opinion, I think this is why so many people are in that second bucket there where, you've tried and you've dabbled and you've experimented, and maybe you built a really good spreadsheet that one time, or maybe you stuck with it for a couple of weeks and it feels like you fell off the wagon. That's totally normal. And if you answer that and maybe you're feeling a little bit of guilt and shame about it, notice that 70% of participants feel the exact same way. So clearly there's so many of us who feel this way. It's probably not us as individuals. It's probably the systems that aren't necessarily designed to work with how our brains work. So common money challenges I hear when I'm working with clients, and maybe some of these will resonate with you as well: an inability to save money, feeling like maybe you're in debt and you can't really get out of it, or it's like a cycle where you get out of debt and then you just can't seem to stay out of it, or if maybe you overspend and it just feels like the budget never works for you, you just can't stick to it over time. Those are very, very common money challenges. And I would argue that a good budget is actually going to address and proactively give you systems for some of those challenges. These are symptoms of a bigger problem, though. It's not always easy to see our money clearly. So think about when you are spending money. For most of us, we have this cobbled together structure of systems where you might have a bank account, you might have savings and checking, you might use a debit card for some things, you might have a credit card for other things, you might sometimes randomly receive or dabble in using cash. So for me, a millennial, that's like hard no. Though every now and then it does happen. So we've got all these transactions happening in different places, and the type of spending that we do is also so variable and so unpredictable that it's really hard to kind of see where our money's going, and it just causes a big lack of clarity. So this is in another few places as well. In terms of random expenses, one of the biggest things I hear from folks is that they might be doing well, their budget's chugging along, they're feeling good about their progress, and then some unexpected whammy comes along and their car breaks down, or you need new tires, or it's back to school season and everybody needs clothes, or it's a holiday, now it's time to buy presents for everybody. Or, maybe you're having a chill few months and then hopefully we'll all be able to travel again soon, and now all of a sudden everybody's travel budget will go through the roof, right? So we've got this sort of boom and bust cycle with our spending that can be very hard to account for and very hard to get straight on what that looks like. Those are the big categories, but a lot of us also struggle with this in our day-to-day spending. So notice that we've still kind of got this wavy line experience, but now it's within a tighter band. So as a baseline, you always have to kind of keep food on the table. You got to keep the lights on. You've got to keep gas in your car if you drive. So your day-to-day spending, there is sort of a baseline that we need in order to continue our comfortable existence. But, there are plenty of other things that we spend our money on that might be a little bit more discretionary that can cause our spending to fluctuate too. If you have a week where you need to make a lot of online purchases, if you decide to go shopping, if you decide to order in food that you might not normally do, that can be a week or a month where those day-to-day habits can really add up a lot more than they normally would. And finally, for some of us, this lack of clarity even comes from income. So if you are working currently, you might have a standard paycheck, but for some of us, our income is variable. For small business owners, entrepreneurs, freelancers, that can be a big challenge. There are also a number of periods in our lives where we tend to get little spikes in income. So for example, a lot of folks, especially those with traditional like tax withholding jobs, might get a refund. If you get paid every other week, there's going to be 2 months out of the year where you actually get 3 paychecks that month. So, we sometimes see spikes in income that can be hard to plan for. And with all of the lack of clarity and the random expenses in the day-to-day spending buckets, when you do get a spike of income, it might feel like you're constantly having to play catch up or using that money to handle other categories rather than using that spike in income to get to proactively plan for your goals. So we kind of need a system that addresses all of this tangled mess and gives us some structure to make a little bit more sense of it without having to feel like we are required to save receipts or put every single line item in a spreadsheet. That's what we're going for here. So just to check in again, y'all, one other question for you. What budget category gives you the most stress? So let's get this poll up here. Go ahead and vote for me. It'd be super useful to know where everybody is at. Paying bills on time. Do you struggle with the little day-to-day stuff? Is it the big unexpected emergencies and whammies that really gets you? Or do you maybe have variable income and that's the hardest thing for you to plan? So answer that for us and we'll see where everybody sits.
All right, we will share our results here. So with 53% of the vote, folks say little day-to-day spending that adds up quickly. 32% of people on the line say unexpected whammies and emergencies. 10% share variable income as giving them the most stress, and 5% say paying bills on time.
Awesome. So it sounds like we've mostly got the basics on lock. We'll talk a little bit about paying bills on time. But I think our work today then will be to try and get you guys some good systems that you can use to manage your day-to-day spending and plan ahead for some of those unexpected items. Awesome. All right, so back to this idea of a traditional budget. One other thing that I've noticed about traditional budgets is they all tend to have the same formula involved. So it's very basic and it works in theory, but maybe not in practice. You've got your income coming in, you've got your expenses coming out, and then everything left over is savings. So this is really good in theory, but the flip side is in practice, there's rarely anything left over. So when you do a traditional budget, what happens on paper does not always match up what happens in the real world. And again, that's where the issue of tracking comes in order to map your real world chaos onto this very neat traditional equation, you have to be so on top of everything that happens with your money. You have to get it all in this structure in order to try and scrape some savings together. So that's no good. We don't want that. Again, traditional budgets too, they tend to be more of a fixed point in time. So there's a little pinpoint there on the left, that's Atlanta, Georgia. That's where I'm presenting from today. If I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and I want to know how to get to New York, it's not always useful for me to know everything that happened in the past. It can be informative, but it doesn't tell the whole story. If I'm trying to reach a goal or if I'm trying to plan ahead for something, I need a roadmap to get there. I need more structure, I need more planning in order to really know how to get from Atlanta to New York. Notice too, if you've ever used any sort of map software, you'll notice that there are always multiple routes to get to those goals. So I say this because I think a lot of people, again, we associate budgeting with scarcity. We associate it with not getting enough of what you want. And so instead, what I'll offer you is a budget is just a tool to get more of what you want, period. So there are plenty of ways to make that happen. Sometimes, you know, if a goal is really meaningful to you, you might cut back substantially on your budget. And sometimes you might make the value judgment that it's just not super worth it to cut out everything you love. There are plenty of ways to get to point A to point B. So don't feel confined by any particular route. You want something that's going to give you a lot of options. So in a nutshell, a traditional system really doesn't have data that's useful for making future decisions. We want to get you something else. We want to get you an actual roadmap, a set of structures that get you from point A to point B. So let's talk about those systems and structures, and let's talk about how the Young and Scrappy budgeting system is a little bit different and kind of helps dovetail nicely into what you actually want to accomplish with your money. When it comes to budgeting, I think that giving yourself common sense, easy to follow systems for all the main types of spending that you do is going to be more useful than almost any app or spreadsheet that you use on an ongoing basis. So we'll talk about what that looks like and ways to structure your money and your bank accounts to make them work for you. The first thing I want to do here is getting back to this idea of lack of clarity, thinking about where our money goes and how all of those different types of spending buckets can cause us a little bit of stress. I want to think about dividing our spending into 3 budgeting categories today. And each of these is going to have its own system with it. So the first is your recurring expenses. Those are the, day-to-day, like monthly recurring bills. The second is the day-to-day spending, all of the little transactions that happen, groceries, gas, coffee, you name it. And then the third bucket is the non-recurring and random expenses or unpredictable expenses. So the first here is fixed and recurring bills. And only 5% of you said that this was a little bit of a challenge. If that's you, again, no shame. Everybody starts somewhere different, but there are some really great ways to stay organized that you might find useful here. When it comes to fixed and recurring bills, I overwhelmingly recommend you take some time to make a list of everything that you owe, all of your bills, the amounts, and the due dates. You can do this on pen and paper. You can bust out a spreadsheet if that makes you feel good. You can even use a calendar, however you like to visualize data. But for me, I think it's really, really useful to start to put your bills in due date order. So the goal here, the goal of this exercise is to sort of create your master bill pay calendar where everything is organized by date and the amount. That way, you take a glimpse at it. You should know exactly what money in theory should be coming out of your account on a recurring basis. Everything that's going to happen every month, this is what would go in this bucket. Notice that the focus here is not on like a fun bill versus a not fun bill. We're sort of getting rid of this old model of like, this is discretionary spending versus this is a budget need, right? We're thinking about this in terms of timing and predictability. So you would include stuff on here like rent and utilities, but you would also include your Netflix subscription. You would include your Prime Pantry that happens automatically every single month. So we're looking at things that recur, not necessarily whether it's like a fun item or a boring item. So take those, get the amounts, the due dates in due date order. So why do you do this? Well, the good thing about having all this information condensed in this way is it can start to think about paying bills in linear fashion. So a lot of us, maybe we have some things on auto pay, maybe we're paying things manually, but we have a good bit of flexibility for some of these bills. Certainly subscription is going to hit the same day every month, but credit card, debt payments, utilities, oftentimes there's a window, a 3 to 4 week window in which we can actually get those bills paid. And so what you can do is start to reorganize your bills by paycheck rather than as like an overall theoretical month. This is also going to make paying your bills a lot more quick, and you can pay those bills when you get paid rather than on the due date. So your paycheck hits, you open up your list of bills, you go in there, you make all of the quick transfers of everything that's going to happen before the next paycheck. And then you've taken a half hour, everything is neat and organized, and you can rest easy knowing that all of the money that is really earmarked for rent and bills is going to come out of your account. We don't have to worry about playing that game of like, can I really buy this thing because here's what I've got coming out next. So you can sort of plan ahead, make this a quick, efficient process. So I want to move forward and I want to talk a little bit about day-to-day spending because overwhelmingly this is the biggest category that folks have trouble with sometimes. So again, day-to-day spending, I want to think about this in terms of all of the little transactions that happen day to day. So this is the boring stuff. It's gas and groceries. It's also the fun stuff, dining out or ordering in, I guess, in these trying times, entertainment, whatever that looks like, anything that kind of has a lot of little transactions to go coffee shop orders with curbside delivery, whatever your jam is these days. For day-to-day spending, again, I want to get away from this paradigm of like, these are your important necessities like groceries, and this is your fun stuff like coffee. What I've found in working with probably hundreds of people at this point is that our brains on paper will understand the difference between fun stuff and boring stuff. And in practice, we don't. So if you are getting groceries, for example, this is a necessity, but it's also in many ways one of our biggest and most flexible expenses. If you wanted to eat nothing but beans and rice to get your human caloric intake every single day, you could actually spend very, very little on food. But in practice, what happens is we buy the things we like, we buy the brands we enjoy, we go to the grocery store hungry and we end up with a cart full of snacks. That's just me, not pointing fingers here, but that's where I'm at right now. So all of this day-to-day spending, we actually have a lot more control over it than we think. How I recommend folks handle it is to kind of lump all of these categories together, all of your day-to-day spending items, and figure out how much you need per pay period or per week. So thinking back to traditional budgeting tools like Mint or You Need a Budget, they'll say, this is your grocery budget, and this is your gas budget, and this is your shopping budget. And now for every month, you need to put all of your transactions into these neat little windows. Rather than taking the type of purchase as the category, I want to challenge you to do it by time period instead. So it's really hard to say, I've got $800 a month for groceries, but it's much easier to say, I've got $300 a week for everything I need. If it's a big grocery week, that's what I'm buying. If I need to go shopping, that's what I'm buying instead. You have the flexibility to decide. So determine how much you need for spending money per week. This is my recommended time frame because 7 days, it feels good to have a reset after 7 days. And then you can take this out in cash. We're millennials, ignore that part, or use a separate debit card. This is my preferred system. When you figure out how much you need for day-to-day spending, you can set up a weekly transfer to a separate debit card. And that way you kind of have given yourself a neat little allowance bucket to pull from for all of those transactions. This is going to make your spending a lot more tangible. All of a sudden, it's not this big guessing game of where's my money going. It kind of takes all of these little things and it turns it into one easy fixed expense per week. The best news about this is you won't have to track every penny as long as you stick to your limit. So again, imagine that you've given yourself $150 a week for spending money. It's on a separate debit card. If you want to know whether you can afford to buy something, you simply pull up your banking app, you look at that separate checking account, and now the calculus is very different. It's not, hey, I just got paid and I feel like I can afford anything I want. It's Thursday. I have $72.08 left. Do I really want to order pizza? So we want to try and make this big, confusing set of purchases, and we want to give you a lot of structure and clarity on how much money is really available for you to spend. Finally, let's talk for a couple minutes about some of these non-recurring and random expenses. Again, these are the things that tend to come up in a more variable fashion. So you might have a month where there are no unexpected expenses, but then you might have a month where your car breaks down, you need to buy a plane ticket to go visit family, it's a holiday and it's gifting season, something breaks on your home, all of those types of repairs and emergencies. So what I would challenge you to do is make a list of all of the things that have caught you off guard. And this can be things that have really high dollar items. So it can be like if your car breaks catastrophically or you have an old vehicle, it might, be a big category for you. Other things might present more of a challenge to other folks. But think about what has caught you off guard. This can even include smaller items. So if you have something like an Amazon Prime subscription or something that renews annually, maybe it's only a couple $100, but if it catches you off guard and it's a problem for you, then that's something you really want to identify and figure out how much you would need to save per month in order to feel good that that category is well planned for. So determine a monthly average for each category that gives you trouble. And here's the kicker. Highly recommend you set up separate savings accounts and transfer a set amount to each of those buckets per month. So again, well, think about the old traditional budget. You put everything on paper, you're like, cool, $100 a month for car maintenance. But if you don't have any issues with car maintenance that month, what tends to happen, you're not really letting that money hang out in your account. It kind of sneaks away elsewhere. It kind of goes to other things that are more of a priority. And that can be a real big problem 3 months down the line when an actual car emergency happens and all of a sudden you need $300 and it's just not there. So rather than getting everything out on paper, that might be a good starting point. We want to take the next step and say, for each of these categories, if we're giving it a monthly amount, we want to actually move the money out of our main checking account into a savings account so we know how much is clearly available to spend. Here's a mock-up of what that might look like. So this is actually a mock-up through Capital One 360, which is a neat bank because it actually allows you to have up to 50 separately labeled savings accounts without any savings account fees. I don't get paid to say that. I just think they're really neat. So what this might look like in practice is you've got a bill pay account where all of your direct deposit hits. You're paying yourself an allowance for spending over the course of a pay period or a week, whatever that looks like for you. And then you've kind of identified different buckets that are really important. So you might have emergencies in the truest sense of the word. You might be saving for a family trip or holidays or home improvement project. And notice that, instead of the bank account number being listed, you can actually change the name of the account so it shows up in your app differently. You might want to check for that functionality in whatever bank you're currently using because it's definitely handy to keep yourself on track. And you can label those items You can even label if you have a goal associated with them, because sometimes it can help you stay a little bit more motivated to see what that progress looks like a little bit more easily. So this is a great system because it gets the money safely out of your checking account, again, out of sight, out of mind. It also gives you budgets for important categories, helps you save for whammies. And for those of you who are maybe really, really interested in credit card points, if you sort of play the like points and miles game, a lot of people I know don't necessarily love to use debit for everything, because then they're like, oh, I can't get my points and miles if everything's going on my debit card. These types of savings buckets, however, are a great opportunity for strategic credit card use, because now it's not putting something on a credit card and hoping the numbers work out later. You're charging something on a credit card that you know you can easily pull money from savings and pay off that credit card right away on those big ticket items, get the points, move on without sacrificing the other aspects of your financial health. So the goal here after all of this work is that every month should start to look the same. So we've kind of started in chaos, but we want to create something that's a lot more streamlined. So when your paycheck comes in, you're using your bill pay calendar, you're paying your bills, you're getting all of that money out to the bills where it needs to go. Then you take out your cash, you're setting aside your allowance either per pay period or per week to say all of the day-to-day spending needs to fit in this neat little bucket, put it on a separate debit card and it should track itself. Then finally, you're going to save for your upcoming expenses. All of those whammy categories you identified that get their own monthly amount, you're going to make those transfers out to those accounts. So that way, without really having to track every penny or use a spreadsheet, you can look at your bank account and get a really quick, easy snapshot of how much money is available to spend on what. And the goal is here that there should also be a little bit of money left for buffer, such that after you're implementing the budget system, you've kind of got all of these things in a very clear structure. And so now when you get your tax refund, or now when you get a holiday present or something happens and you get a third paycheck per month, whatever that looks like for you, that income can actually go towards the goals that you've identified and created savings accounts for. It can go towards paying down debt. It can go towards investing. You're using that extra spike in income to further what you want to accomplish, rather than feeling like you constantly have to clean up whatever's happened for you in the past. So that's kind of my goal, and that's how it works in theory. I'm going to share just a couple of like nitpicky practical tips for getting started, a couple of thoughts on how to stick to this over time, and then I want to make sure that we have plenty of time at the end for Q&A, just to make sure that everybody's budget questions get answered. If you have those, feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we'll make sure to get those at the end. So practical tips for getting started. Like I said, in Chicago fashion, we're moving now from the theory to the practice, sticking to your budget over time. So the basics for getting started. You want to get all of your information in one place. You want to make sure your budget balances. And then this is also very important. You need to make sure that you are adjusting over time as your life changes. So budget information. A lot of people struggle with this. Again, we talked about the lack of clarity at the beginning of this presentation. This means that your budget information is also strewn out all over the place. So here are a couple of ways that I recommend getting your data together. First, be sure to check on your pay stub for that income information. When it comes to budgeting, I overwhelmingly recommend using the number that actually hits your account. So a lot of folks I've seen will use the number that hits their account, but then in their budget, they might put like retirement contributions or health insurance. If it comes out of your paycheck from your employer, leave it off the budget, but just put the amount that actually hits your account. We want to budget for what you actually have available to spend more than anything else. Your budget information might also come from past bills and email confirmation. So a lot of places now, if you have something recurring monthly, they'll send you a receipt and they'll say, thank you for your purchase. Here's your receipt for whatever it is that you're subscribed to or whatever it is you bought. So if you search in your email the words confirmation or the words receipt, it might pull up for you a record of things that you have spent money on. And you can notice too, as you're scrolling down that list of filtered emails, what places are emailing you every month. Those are the ones you want to make sure that you're really including on your bill pay calendar. What are the ones that come up once per year? A lot of places that you might have an annual subscription to, often a few days before the thing hits, They'll send you a, hey, heads up, don't forget your subscription is auto-renewing on July 16th. And then once it happens, they'll be like, thank you for your payment. So email confirmations can also be a great way to find things that typically would fall through the cracks without having to like dig back like through a full month of bank statements and credit card statements. Which brings me to my next point. Sometimes there is no substitute for combing through past bank statements and past credit card statements. This is especially true with any bills that are on auto pay, because you can skim down one statement and you can probably pick out 6 or 7 different items that need to make it on your bill pay calendar. The last thing that I'll say about budget information, the day-to-day spending is the piece that a lot of people have trouble tracking, right? We don't typically have a good system for it, and that's why half of us are here today. So just know this, you may have to guess. Don't spend an eternity climbing through every single credit card statement in your entire life trying to figure out how much you spent at Target and what part of that was bills, or which part of that was groceries versus household expenses versus clothing. Cut yourself a break. Know that you might want to skim a few statements and try a couple numbers and experiment with some things. Certainly, if you find it really useful to have highly granular data, I'm not going to stop you. I'm not your mom, but I don't want you to feel like you have to have perfect information, perfect to the penny understanding of where things have gone in the past in order for you to make behavioral change in the future. So do your best to at least be very clear on dollars and cents for anything that's recurring and predictable, but for some of the unpredictable stuff, a skim, a guess, that stuff's totally fine. So I did fill out or get started with a little spreadsheet for you. So hopefully, I think this is something that Sam sent a few hours ago, but this is going to help you kind of get started. And it's structured in the way that this budgeting system is structured. So there's income. We've got your recurring expenses where you can list everything that's very predictable. We've got your day-to-day spending where you can enter a monthly amount, and then it will help you calculate a weekly allowance. And then at the end, which you can't see on this little fake iPad mock-up, at the very bottom, there's also space for you to put in all of your whammy categories and your unpredictable expenses, and you will put in an annual number, and it's actually going to scale everything to a monthly number. So if you're needing a good resource, it's very basic just to get all of your information in one place. This is a tool you can use to help you get started. Once your information is in one place, you then need to see whether it's balanced. And so when we think about like a balanced budget, that means that your income is roughly equal to your expenses plus your savings. So if you think about it in the purest sense, the most perfectly balanced budget would be income minus expenses minus savings equals 0. That every single dollar has a job, every single dollar is accounted for on where you want it to go. Remember, a budget is telling your money where to go. So we want to make sure that every dollar here has a job. When you go through this exercise for the first time, because a lot of us use numbers that are either aspirational, or maybe it's stuff that happened in the past and you're not super proud of it and you're ready to make some changes. When you first do the draft of your budget, it's very common for things not to balance. So don't feel bad. If you're overspending, you have a few options of how to proceed. So as you're going through making your bill pay calendar and getting your monthly expenses in one place, this is a really good opportunity to do a subscriptions audit. So a lot of us have stuff that we have gotten that auto renews. We're too lazy to cancel. Again, no shame. I once had a YMCA membership 6 months without going to the gym even once. I was too lazy to cut it. It was a monumental waste of money for me. So everybody does it. Everybody has 1 or 2 things that they just don't use anymore. It might not be relevant, or it's an annual subscription. And every year you're like, this is the year I'm going to cancel it. And then it auto hits and you're like, crap, next year is the year I'm going to cancel it. So take the time, go through those subscriptions, see what's working and not working for you, make any cuts you can. You might also find that your allowance is just a little bit high. Again, a lot of us struggle with day-to-day spending. This is going to be sort of a trial and error experiment where you start out with a certain allowance number and maybe it's a little bit too much money, or you want to slightly start to dial that weekly amount back. $100 a month might feel like a lot, but maybe 25 bucks a week doesn't feel like a huge behavior change for you. So you might be able to reduce that allowance number in a way that still feels all right. You might simply just have to put less money towards your savings goals or prioritize savings goals, pick the couple that are, most vital or most important to you, and then wait on the others. Or I think this is something that enough people don't talk about. You can also increase your income. So if you decide, you look at your budget and you're like, fundamentally, there are zero changes I would like to make to my spending. Everything is perfect. I just need more money. That's also technically an option for you. Just know that that one can be a little bit harder. It might take a little bit more time to make that work, whether that's asking for a raise at your current job, finding a side hustle, starting a small business, whatever that looks like for you. That's definitely an option that I'll put on the table. If you're underspending, congratulations, unicorn, this is for you. You can spend more money on the items you value. Sometimes you might be in a situation where if you have a constant sense of scarcity, that might not actually play out in the real world. You might be foregoing things that you think you flat out can't afford. You might want to up your budget in certain places. You could pay down debt faster. You could reach your savings goals more quickly. Or one other thing that I'll kind of add to this list, if your budget is balanced and it's looking like a lot of money is left over, but every single month you're like, wait a second, but there isn't a lot of money left over, double check your numbers. You might have left something off. You might have forgotten a big bill or a recurring expense or something that needs to be added. So double check for that as well. But if you're underspending, know that this is an opportunity to, again, the goal of a budget is to get more of what you want. So you want to figure out, how can I route these dollars in a way that makes the most sense for me, that brings me joy, or brings me utility? You might need to do a couple drafts to make this right. So get your numbers in one place, see whether you're overspending or underspending, start to make some cuts, give your budget a little zhuzhing, and then hopefully after tweaking the numbers, playing with things, canceling stuff, you can kind of come to a finalized budget that you're going forward. Once you've got that finalized, I would say that's maybe 25% of the work, right? Because a lot of us, we've made the budget before. The question is, how do we stick to it? These are just a couple of tips. Again, I'm a big fan of systems. I'm a big fan of structures. So checking in with your budget at least monthly and making it an important part of your financial life is really important. When it comes to, I call this a monthly money date, your relationship with money is just that. It's a relationship. You've got to give it love. You've got to give it some quality time if you want to, have it be a fruitful long-term relationship. So I recommend carve out an hour or two per month, put it on your calendar, treat it the same way that you would a date with a friend, an important Zoom call. Because if you don't check in with your budget, if something changes, if you take on new expenses, if your income changes, your budget can change. You need to make sure that your stuff is staying with it. I also overwhelmingly recommend creating a separate account for your allowance. This doesn't have to overhaul your whole financial system. I'm not saying you have to switch banks. I'm just saying I would highly recommend you look into your current bank, getting a second checking account where you are already banking. That way you won't have to switch off any of those auto pays. You won't have to move everything over. You're just trying to create space for yourself to really separate out that spending money so that you're not making decisions based off your whole pool of money. You're making decisions based off the weekly allowance that you have given yourself. A separate account is going to help you stick to it over time, probably more than any other recommendation I make in this presentation. That's a big one. Finally, because now you have this structure, you can start to put as many bills and transfers on auto pay as possible. And again, with some of these, you can time them through your bank. So if you're paying a bill directly to a service with a check or whatever, you have control over that timing. But many banks have bill pay capabilities where you can go in, you can link all of your vendors in there, and you can set them up. You can set up those auto pays for when your paychecks hit. And that way everything is kind of structured around when you get paid. And that way the money is safely out of your account. Same thing with those savings transfers. This is a great way to balance some of the bills and the savings. So for example, if you're looking at your bill pay calendar and you're like, all of my bills seem to happen in the first half of the month, then you might put all of your savings goal transfers in the second half of the month for that second paycheck. But putting as much on auto pay as possible will really help you not forget to make those transfers. You don't want to forget to save. You want it to happen comfortably in the background so that you can live your best life while all of your money is slowly taking care of itself. So those are some tips for sticking to it over time, just to kind of keep yourself organized on an ongoing basis. All right, we've got 20 minutes left for questions. Sam, do we have any questions that we need to get answered for folks?
We certainly do. And to everyone on the line, we want to make this session really personal to you and to your situation. So please don't hesitate to send questions in. I do have a number that are in here, so we're just going to launch right into it. First of all, Michelle, thank you so much for sharing this great content with us. So question number one, how would you recommend going about setting savings goals in particular?
Yeah, so savings goals in particular, I think, like in terms of developing savings goals, they usually come from two places. It's something you want to plan for that you don't want to get caught off guard for, or something that you want in the future that's really exciting and interesting to you. So coming up with that list, I think, is the first step. But when you brainstorm your list, you might find that you don't necessarily have enough money to support every single one of those goals. And so then it sort of becomes a matter of prioritization and saying, how much do I really care about this one versus another in a world where maybe you only have a few $100s to devote to all of those savings goals entirely. So prioritization. And then finally, when it comes to figuring out how much to put aside for those savings goals, again, you have a couple of options. If it's sort of a generic goal that's pretty unpredictable, so like medical expenses, car maintenance, whatever, for those, you might consider going ahead and figuring out how much it would cost you in an average year and just divide it by 12. And that sort of becomes the number that you're putting into that account on a regular basis. And that way, when something happens, the money is hopefully there. Sometimes there are timing issues, right? If you start this next month and then that same month a car situation happens, it's not going to be perfect, but at least you're starting to plan ahead for some of the stuff that's happening in the future. And then finally, some of your goals are going to be time bound. So if you are in July and you want to do something in November, and you know, I've got 4 months to go to save, if you know how much it's going to cost, you might not think of it on an annual basis. You might say how much it costs divided by 4 to reach that goal in time. And then that kind of becomes your saving amount. So hopefully that answers your question, but that's kind of how I would approach the process of saving for those goals.
Okay, wonderful. I just cut out for a second, so I'm so sorry about that if that affected anything. But here is another question. My husband and I have a hard time tracking our budget as a couple. Do you have any suggestions for tracking a budget as a couple? Should one person do it all? Should each person track their own budget? What would you suggest there?
Yeah, so tracking finances as a couple is definitely a challenge because it increases the complexity involved with the budget. So now it's not just you and your actions, it's you and your spouse or partner's actions too, all kind of pulling from the same pool of money. So a couple of options here. I would say in terms of getting the budget built, I think it's really important for everybody to kind of be on the same page. When it comes to the tracking, if one person has a passion for that more than everybody else, then it might be okay that some of the nitpicky work of figuring out the transfers and the implementation might fall to the person who likes that more. But again, if you're thinking about this from an ongoing standpoint, if you're having those monthly money dates, that's a really good opportunity for you to come together, double check, make sure everything is working the way that it should, make sure that all of your spending is still where you want it to be. One other thing that I'll say for couples, I mentioned a weekly allowance. Sometimes I think it's really useful for couples to have their own weekly allowance. So again, we want to eliminate as much complexity as possible. If each person gets, a set amount of money on a separate debit card, it will introduce more cards, but it will also sort of give you each your own pool of money to spend from. I think that's nice to make sure that everybody in the relationship maintains a sense of independence while at the same time putting some clear boundaries on what you both agreed you're comfortable each spending. One final thing I'll leave you with in terms of budgeting for couples, I feel like there is an expectation in serious relationships that when you get to a certain point, your job is to combine finances, or if you get legally married or you've entered a domestic partnership together, now your relationship is in the big leagues and you have to combine all your money. Just know that that's not necessarily the case. The goal of managing your money as a couple is to find something that works for you. I've seen happily married couples, partnered couples who've been together for decades, and everything is separate, everything is combined, or like a whole spectrum on the middle. So Feel free to also revisit your overall system, and don't be afraid to ask, like, hey, is this working for us? What things need to be combined? What things should be separate? Know that you have the freedom and the power to create a structure that works for you. There shouldn't be any expectations on what a good relationship looks like from the standpoint of combining finances.
Awesome. And then we got a few questions coming in about that, that Chase system that you showed a screenshot of that had the multiple accounts. Can you just share a few more tips about how you create that? And then maybe are there other banks that offer similar opportunities to create multiple accounts? And then just kind of jumping off of that, are you paying for each account in that case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some banks are more friendly to this system than others. So the screenshot I showed was Capital One, and the way that this mock-up was structured is it's 2 checking accounts. One is presumably used for like main bill pay. So that's where the direct deposit would go into. That's where all of the auto pays for the recurring bills would come out of. And then there's a second checking account for your weekly allowance, and that would get a weekly auto pay from the main bill pay account. And then there are all of these little separate savings accounts that are clearly labeled with the names of the goals. And again, those all get a monthly auto transfer from the main bill pay account with a timing that works for you. The mock-up is from Capital One. They're a great resource for this. There are no checking and savings fees. So you can have 2 checking accounts, multiple savings accounts. If you use an ATM a lot and you hate paying ATM fees, maybe that's not a bank for you. It's an online bank, so you're not really going to be able to go into a branch and talk to a person. Not that any of us are doing much of that these days anyway, so now's a great time to switch in that regard. Another bank that I've seen work out really well for this is also Ally Bank. It's another online bank. Those are great for building out this infrastructure of the multiple accounts. Some of the more traditional banks are going to be a little bit trickier, and you'll have to be judicious in figuring out a system that works for you. But one thing that I'll offer you is like a mindset hack. In some cases, your first checking account might be free, and some places might charge you $10 a month for a second one. I would see this as a behavioral tool that you are paying for. So if you knew that you could save $400 a month by being really consistent with an allowance that tracks itself, would you be willing to pay $10 for that the same way that you would maybe for like a budget app? With the savings accounts especially, some of them allow you to have like capped number of savings accounts. It's just unfortunately going to depend on your bank, how wedded you are to your current system and whether you're willing to switch.
That is a great way to kind of shift your paradigm, change your thinking around paying for an account. All right, we have a few questions about this as well. How would you recommend tracking expenses that are regular but not occurring every month, perhaps every 6 to 8 weeks, something like a haircut or other similar expenses?
Yeah, so for those types of expenses, I think there are 2 ways you can handle it. So if it's pretty frequent and maybe not super expensive, I would lump it in with your weekly allowance. So like a haircut, if you go get your nails done or something, and maybe it's like $30 every 6 weeks, that's not a huge amount of money compared to your weekly allowance. So you might be able to just comfortably fold that in. And if it's a week where you're getting a haircut, maybe that's a week where you're not really going shopping, or it's a week where you're being a little bit more careful with your grocery spend. The other alternative is if you have items like that that tend to be much more expensive, then that's an opportunity for you to create a separate savings account, or another word for this is sinking fund. So for example, if you get your hair done twice per year, and every time you do it, it's like cut, color, very expensive, couple $100, and that's hard for you to plan for, you might consider putting $50 a month into savings for that. So there's a lot of categories like that, which could kind of go either way. They might be an allowance account if you're spending them kind of casually over time, and if they tend to stack up in a big way, you might consider a sinking fund for that. I personally actually have a sinking fund set up for my car insurance. I pay it once every 6 months to save money, but it's a good chunk of change when it does come around. And past Michelle, who also hated budgeting, was not good at keeping track with it. So after I started transferring $100 a month to a savings account, I never have a problem paying my car insurance on time, and it's very good.
That is a great tip. Okay, so here's a great question for anyone who's an hourly employee, or maybe our folks in the gig economy or freelance workers. For a lot of these folks, paychecks might be pretty variable. How do you recommend dealing with budgeting so that you always feel like you have enough to pay your bills, even if your paycheck is really small, if you're maybe taking a vacation or it's the holidays or something like that?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways to handle that. And I think it honestly just depends on how much variability is in your budget. So if you have maybe an hourly job, but you know that every week you're working between like 35 and 40 hours, right? So there's not going to be a ton of variance in the amount of money that you get per paycheck. You might consider making a standard budget, but just being a little bit more on the conservative side. Maybe choosing your lowest paycheck or your second to lowest paycheck, planning around that. And that way you kind of know that when you do have a month where you work a lot extra, then that on top of your budget is something that you can allocate extra towards your goals or extra towards paying down debt or whatever that looks like for you. If your income is wildly variable, so if you are a freelancer and you work on project basis, or you have seasonal work, anything like that, then I think you have to get a little bit more creative. That's where I think the budgeting really does get pretty tricky. And for that, honestly, what I would recommend is, again, you want to be pretty conservative in making your budget, but your budget will kind of necessarily have to be an average of how much you make. But what I'll offer you is, like, a lot of people who are freelancers or entrepreneurs, we get on this income roller coaster where, like, a good month happens and like a lot of money comes in and it's like, heck yeah, this is the time to go on vacation or the time to get whatever we want. And then you might have a slow month and then it's like, holy crap, where's my money? How am I going to pay my bills? So if that's you and you're really like on that roller coaster, I would encourage you to build a pretty conservative budget, and then maybe even give yourself like a staging account for your income, where again, not to like increase the complexity too much, but if your income all kind of hits a different account, you can kind of pay yourself very consistently regardless of where your money is coming in. So if you're making, you know, $3,000 a month on average, but sometimes you make zero and sometimes you make $6,000. If you have a $6,000 month, you can set aside the rest and commit to only spending what's budgeted, knowing that down the line, if you have a slow month, you kind of have a reserve to pull from. So that's usually how I would recommend doing it. And again, if you're a freelancer, small business owner, and you want to manage your business finances, one other thing that I'll recommend to you, it's like pretty similar to this system, but designed for business owners. There's a book called Profit First, and it's by Mike Michalowicz, and it basically walks through an account-based common sense banking system for business owners that helps you take very like hyper variable income and smooth it out into something that looks a lot more consistent. So there are options for you. Do not despair. Just because you have variable income does not mean that your budget has to be a total nightmare.
Here's another great question that I think speaks to a lot of millennials who might find themselves being perpetual renters. Can you speak to building credit as a really important piece of a stable financial future? This person who submits the question said they've only recently started using a credit card. They find the idea of building credit to be a hopeless rabbit hole / catch-22 situation. Please help.
Yeah, credit scores are the worst because in order to get debt, you have to have had debt. And it can feel like a rabbit hole and a catch-22. So this is one thing that I almost always consider like an actual necessary evil. But credit scores are basically just a measure of how likely you are to pay debt back. So thinking about it this way, if you were to let a friend borrow your car, you would first ask, have you ever been in any accidents? And your friend would hopefully be like, no, I'm all good. I have a clean driving record, and you maybe hand over your keys. But your second question would be like, you haven't had any accidents, but how long have you been driving? And if your friend is like, I've been driving for 2 weeks, and you're like, maybe not, right? So your credit score is kind of a function of those things. How long have you been working with debt, and how consistent have you been during that time frame and paying it back on time? So having debt, unfortunately, is the only real way to build credit. Oftentimes, this involves opening up your first credit card, using it responsibly, and paying it off in full every month. What people don't necessarily tell you about credit, though, is that you don't get brownie points for putting more dollars on that credit card. So one tip that I have for folks who are looking to build credit with minimal stress, open up your credit card, get that account, and then hook up one small recurring bill to it. I'm talking Netflix, I'm talking like Dollar Shave Club. put it on auto pay on that card, and then pay that card off in full every month and stick it in a drawer. Don't look at it, don't touch it. You don't get brownie points for putting $1,000 on your credit card and paying it off in full. The way that credit reports are structured, it will show you just if a payment has been made, if it's on time, and if it's in full. So if you are paying $2 a month on Patreon on your credit card and paying it off in full, you are building credit just as well as the person who's charging $1,000 a month and paying it off in full. So don't feel like building credit is out of your reach. It's not, anybody can do it. You just kind of have to know some tricks. If you are really, really early to the game, you're just getting started off, it might be hard for you to find a credit card that works for you. What you might consider doing is checking out a site like creditkarma.com. That's going to let you track your credit over time. And there's actually a tool on there that will look at your credit score, your estimated credit score, and it will say, like, here's a whole list of credit cards, and these are the ones you are likely to get approved for. So don't waste your time applying to really big fancy cards with a ton of perks if it's your very first credit card. Unfortunately, the odds of you getting approved are not super high. So start with like a starter card with no annual fee. Find something that your approval odds are pretty good. Put your one standard bill on there and pay it off in full every month. And other than that, you know, that's a great way to build credit without any real stress or effort.
Great, and I think we have time for one more lightning round question. Back to multiple savings accounts. The reason this person says that they've stayed with their bank, Wells Fargo, is because it's their oldest account. Is it worth a potential ding to your credit score to close your oldest account in favor of maybe a more flexible account like the Capital One account you mentioned?
Yeah, so just know that your credit report and your credit score are designed to pull in information about your debt accounts, not your banking accounts. So if you have an old checking account or an old savings account with Wells Fargo, that's actually not really going to be an important part of your credit score because those aren't debt accounts. If you have a Wells Fargo credit card, you might consider keeping that open, but you can, you know, switch your primary bank without any negative repercussions to your credit.
Awesome. And I will send an email to everyone who registered for this following the session here today with the link to the recording. And Michelle has also graciously offered her email address. So you'll receive her email address by email from me. So if you didn't get your question answered, please feel free to reach out. I've just got a few closing remarks here. So the Young Alumni Career Development Series will continue all summer long with free online professional development webinars, networking opportunities, and it's all designed for alumni who have graduated within the last 10 years. Join us for next week's webinar taking place Wednesday, July 22nd, titled Fearless Salary Negotiation, How to Identify and Articulate Your Personal Value. We've talked about, you know, building your budget. Now let's increase your budget, right? Let's talk about strategies to negotiate your salary, your raise, and your promotion. We're also going to be hosting our regular online alumni coffee and conversations networking event next Friday, July 24th, where you'll be paired randomly with alums from all over the world for a series of speed networking conversations, video conversations over Zoom. And it's been a really fun and really well-received event. I hope you can join us. You can visit our events page at careers.uchicagoalumni.org for the full list of upcoming programs. Finally, I would encourage you to join the UChicago Alumni LinkedIn group if you aren't already a member. I'll send you a link to the group in my follow-up email. This is a great way to grow your UChicago network virtually while we're all online right now. And then you'll see a link to a survey for this event at the close of the meeting. Please take the time to share your feedback. We're always looking for ways to improve our programming and make sure it's meaningful content for you and for your career growth. And I also look forward to sharing any kudos that you have with our wonderful presenter, Michelle. And that leads me to my final point. A big thank you to Michelle for a wonderful presentation today with some very actionable and important tips, especially in a difficult economy. Thank you for taking the time. We really appreciate it, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, to everyone on the line, you guys were phenomenal for joining and taking a step towards building your budget. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.